Okay, I'm going to switch the order up a little bit than what I'd intended. I want to go ahead and continue with the cerebrum and talk about other ways that we can talk about the cerebrum. And here we see it pictured and it's color coded. And there's a reason for these color codes. It's because we can divide the cerebrum up into 4 lobes. And we can do this anatomically and we can do it also functionally. And we'll talk about both in this video. We see here the blue, the light blue is called the frontal lobe, but in particular we see then this darker blue, if you want to call it that, and that's a gyrus right there. That's a specific gyrus in the frontal lobe. It forms the border of the frontal lobe, and the actual border is carried by this division, this sulcus called the central sulcus. It's a very important anatomical landmark. And it divides this gyrus right here, this dark blue region of the frontal lobe from the purple gyrus here in the parietal lobe. So the parietal lobe is located caudally to the frontal lobe. And we'll see that anatomically that's very true, that these are the anatomical designations, but functionally it also is applicable, because what we're going to see is that in this portion of the frontal lobe, this is going to be called the precentral gyrus. So we have the central sulcus, the precentral gyrus in dark blue, and the postcentral gyrus in this purple or magenta or whatever you call that color region. Now, as we will point out, the body is anatomically represented here in both the postcentral and precentral gyri. And it's anatomically apportioned or proportioned according to the amount of neurons that go to a specific region of the body. We'll talk about that more here in a bit, but I wanted to point out that bit of anatomical differentiation that occurs specifically in these areas. So we have the frontal lobe in blue here, the parietal lobe in purple, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe in the lime green. Now the temporal lobe is going to have specific functions associated with it, and again more on those later, but in general we're going to see smell cortex is located here. We're going to see there's a language center employed here. There's also a region down here in its most caudal aspect that will be responsible for facial recognition, which is an incredibly important function for humans, and also is the area for abstract thought. Now in the occipital lobe, it's all about visual information, and so we'll see all the major visual inputs come to the occipital lobe. The parietal lobe's mostly about somatosensory, so sensory information from the somatic parts of the body, primarily the skeletal system and so forth. So pain, temperature, pressure, touch, all of that will be delivered to this region of the brain. And then the frontal lobe, this is the area that distinguishes for us for the most part from other organisms. In the frontal lobe, we have an area called the prefrontal cortex that we'll find more or less in this region. This is really where your personality is established. There are other aspects in here. There's a major language area that we'll talk about as well. And then there's this area that's going to be devoted to the motor functions. And we'll talk again more details about each of those. So the frontal lobe has the motor cortex, an area called an association area, which is what forms the premotor cortex. The premotor cortex then takes in inputs from many regions of the body and makes decisions about them, and those decisions are implemented in the motor cortex. So an association area receives inputs from many sensory modalities and tries to make sense of them in some type of satisfactory motor output. Broca's area, Paul Broca was one of the original neuroscientists, did a lot of neuroanatomical mapping of the brain. And this area is dedicated to him because it is such a vital area for language formation. The frontal eye field, so we'll talk about that more, especially when we get to chapter 16. Control of voluntary eye movements, their movement back and forth, shifting our attention. So attention-directed focusing is part of the frontal lobe as well. The prefrontal cortex, the imminent place for determination of our personality. Okay, just to emphasize that, the association area of the brain, it gets inputs from vast regions of the brain, and they all come here together for us to make decisions about how we're going to present ourselves to the outside world. So there is the frontal lobe in the brain. The parietal lobe is the somatosensory cortex, also known as the post-central gyrus that we talked about, that was colored in purple 2 slides back. This is receiving all sensory inputs in terms of pressure, touch, vibration, are coming into that portion of the parietal lobe. We'll also see the taste cortex is located here. Taste is a very complex sensation, and we'll be talking more about that in chapter 16. The temporal lobe, located along the sides of your brain, the temples, right, along the sides of your skull, the temporal lobe is going to have the hearing cortex as well as the olfactory cortex, a region of the language formation called Wernicke's area. It's going to be abstract thought and judgment that is assimilated here, and what I left off this brief list is the idea that the temporal lobe also processes facial recognition. The occipital lobe is entirely about visual information and possesses an association area called the visual association area. There's the parietal lobe, found just caudal to the frontal lobe, the temporal lobes along the lateral margins of the brain, and the occipital lobe in the posterior aspect of the brain. So I've mentioned that we weren't going to delve into this in too great a detail, but this is a region called the basal nuclei, quite extensive set of nuclei shown here that govern certain functions within the brain. This is where most of the gray matter that is deep to the neocortex will be found. And so it receives inputs from the substantia nigra that we already know is associated with motor output, with movement of the body. So it's involved heavily with motor control, the basal nuclei. Here they're delineated in this region. There are several separate nuclei. But again, I don't want to go into this in too much of an over attention to detail. The functions of the nuclei again are that they set the skeletal muscle tone, they coordinate complex movements of the body. The limbic system is made up of a region of the brain called the cingulate gyrus. This is where a lot of your reward and addiction circuitry is found in the body, and it's found just arching over the corpus callosum here. So this purple band is the cingulate gyrus. Another component we haven't talked about that's part of the limbic system, which is what attaches emotional output to your whatever output you're putting, to your motor output. It'll attach an emotional response with that as well, and that's the hippocampus. And we see the hippocampus right in this region, right here. And the hippocampus is all about memory, formation of short-term memory, and then the establishment of long-term memory. And finally, a structure that's near and dear to my heart is the amygdala, which is found right there, just in front of or anterior to the hippocampus. It is our seat for emotional output in terms of fear, anxiety, phobias. So you may have a very interesting amygdala like I do that responds strongly to stimuli and perhaps overreacts to those stimuli by making you over anxious. So the limbic system is both part diencephalon and part cerebrum. It attaches emotional output to outgoing commands, and the conscious functions of the cerebral cortex, it coordinates with the autonomic functions, those things that happen under robotic terms. The major landmarks then in the brain we see here, beautifully illustrated. We've covered all these now. For the most part, there are a couple that we didn't, but for the most part, we've gone through these structures. And this is the picture of an authentic brain that has been bisected, right? It's been bilaterally bisected and we see a sagittal view of it. So the brain, in summary, large, delicate mass of tissue, certainly can be easily destroyed or damaged. The chambers are filled with cerebrospinal fluid. This will be our next video on that particular function. The 6 major regions of the brain that we'll talk about in more detail in a future video. And the brain functions become more complex the further up that we get from the spinal cord. And finally, this is where we do our thinking, where you're able to process information for this class, where your intelligence is located as well. See you next time.